The cabin went silent the moment the flight attendant said it. "Sir, I need you to stand up. Right now." The words landed hard in the narrow aisle of first class on Liberty Air Flight 716, Chicago to Boston. No explanation, no apology, just a command, sharp enough to slice through the low hum of the engines. Conversations died mid-sentence. A fork froze halfway to a mouth. Somewhere, ice clinked once inside a glass. Then nothing. In seat 1A sat a black man in his mid-50s. His name was Charles Bennett. He did not move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look surprised. He simply lifted his eyes, slow and steady, and met the gaze of the woman standing over him. Karen Whitfield stood rigid, shoulders squared, tablet held tight against her chest like a shield. 46 years old, 12 years flying. Her smile was thin, professional, and already cracking at the edges. Her jaw was clenched so hard, the muscle twitched. "I'm going to need you to cooperate," she said, a notch louder now, as if volume alone could create authority. "There's an issue with your seat assignment." Charles glanced down at the small white boarding pass resting on the armrest. First class, seat 1A. His name printed cleanly in black ink. No smudges, no errors. He picked it up between two fingers, calm, deliberate, and held it out. "I checked in online yesterday," he said. His voice was low, even. The kind of voice that had learned long ago that anger only made things worse. Everything was confirmed. Karen didn't take the boarding pass. She didn't need to. Or at least, she believed she didn't. She had already decided what she was seeing. Behind them, the first-class cabin felt suddenly smaller. Too close, too tight. The overhead lights cast a soft amber glow that made every face look older, more tired. Most of the passengers here had grey in their hair. Retired couples, former executives, people who valued order, routine, the comfort of knowing how things were supposed to go. A man in the window seat across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. A woman in pearls stared straight ahead, lips pressed together, pretending the menu in her hands was fascinating. No one spoke. Karen finally glanced at the boarding pass. Just a flick of her eyes, barely a second. Then she shook her head. "The system isn't matching," she said. "It happens. Sometimes people end up in the wrong cabin." Her eyes moved over Charles, quick and assessing. The worn leather briefcase at his feet, the plain navy jacket, sensible shoes, scuffed at the toe, nothing flashy, nothing loud, nothing that fit the image she carried in her mind of who belonged here. Charles noticed the look. He always did. It was subtle, but he had lived with it for decades. The pause, the calculation, the silent question. "Are you supposed to be here?" "I'm happy to wait while you double-check," he said. "Or we can ask the cabin supervisor." For half a second, Karen hesitated. It was there, a crack in her certainty. Then something hardened behind her eyes. "There's no need to escalate this," she replied. "Let's resolve it quickly." Quickly meant quietly. Quickly meant him standing up, gathering his things, disappearing down the aisle without making a scene. From seat 1B, Richard Coleman leaned back and crossed his arms. 62 years old, former plant manager. A man who had spent his life believing in rules and hierarchies, in knowing your place and staying there. He exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh. "These things usually have a reason," he said, not looking directly at Charles. His tone wasn't cruel. It was dismissive, worn smooth by years of unexamined assumptions. "They don't just pick people at random." A few heads nodded, almost imperceptibly. Charles felt it then. The shift. Not just Karen anymore. The cabin itself leaning away from him. He took a breath. Slow. Controlled. He could feel his heartbeat, steady as a metronome. He thought of all the times he had swallowed moments like this. Airports, boardrooms, restaurants where the check was placed in front of someone else. He had promised himself, years ago, that he would not raise his voice. Not here. Not now. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," he said. "I'm asking for verification." Karen's fingers tightened around the tablet. Her knuckles whitened. She glanced toward the galley, then back at him. The aisle behind her was blocked now. Boarding had paused. People in economy were craning their necks, sensing something was wrong, even if they couldn't see it. From 2 rows back, Margaret Lewis watched in silence. 67, retired schoolteacher. She had taught American history for more than 3 decades. Civil rights, Brown versus Board. She had told generations of children that progress came from ordinary moments where someone chose not to look away. Her hands rested in her lap. She did not reach for her phone. Not yet. She studied Charles's face instead. The way his shoulders stayed relaxed. The way his eyes never dropped. The effort it clearly took to remain composed. This wasn't a man trying to sneak into first class. This was a man being tested. Karen cleared her throat. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step into the aisle while I sort this out." Step into the aisle. Stand. Be visible. Charles looked around, at the watching faces, at the closed mouths, at Richard Coleman's fixed expression, already convinced. He felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Not anger, something heavier. Disappointment. "No," he said quietly. "I'll remain seated until we resolve it properly." The word "no" landed harder than any shout. Karen stiffened. She hadn't expected resistance. Not calm resistance. That was always the hardest kind. Her voice sharpened. "If you refuse to follow crew instructions, I will have to involve my supervisor." "Please do," Charles replied. The tension snapped tight, like a wire pulled too far. Somewhere near the back, a bag thudded to the floor. The engines rumbled on, indifferent. Time seemed to stretch, each second thick with unspoken judgment. Karen turned sharply and strode toward the galley, heels clicking against the floor, each step carrying a mix of irritation and something else. Fear, maybe, or the creeping sense that this was no longer a simple correction. Margaret finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. She reached into her purse and took out her phone. She didn't point it. She didn't raise it high. She simply turned on the voice recorder and set it face down on her knee. Just in case. Charles sat back, eyes forward, hands folded. He felt the old familiar exhaustion press against him. He wondered, not for the first time, how many people had lost smaller battles in moments like this. People without the patience, without the language, without the leverage. The supervisor would arrive soon, he knew that. And when he did, the story would change. Not because the truth was different, but because the room would finally be forced to listen. The plane was still at the gate, the door still open. Outside, the jet bridge creaked softly, unaware that something irreversible had already begun. The supervisor did not arrive alone. Thomas Reed stepped into the first-class cabin with the measured calm of a man who had spent more than 20 years diffusing situations before they turned ugly. Early 50s, grey at the temples, a face that carried both authority and fatigue. Behind him, Karen Whitfield stood rigid, arms crossed, her earlier confidence now sharpened into something defensive. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, voice level, eyes already scanning the scene. Phones tucked away too quickly, shoulders stiff, a cabin holding its breath. Karen answered first. "We have a seating discrepancy. The passenger in 1A is refusing to move while we verify." Her phrasing was careful. Refusing. Verify. Neutral words meant to tilt the story before it even began. Thomas turned to Charles. "Sir?" Charles met his gaze. "I'm seated according to my boarding pass. I've asked for verification. That's all." No accusation, no raised voice, just fact. Thomas nodded once and took the boarding pass from Charles's hand. He studied it longer than Karen had. Not seconds, a full read. Name, seat, class, status indicators embedded in the barcode. His brow creased slightly. "Everything looks valid here," Thomas said. Karen shifted her weight. "The manifest didn't match when I checked." Thomas tapped the screen on his device, pulling up the live system. Rows of names, seat assignments, loyalty tiers. He scrolled, paused, scrolled back, then stopped completely. His thumb hovered, motionless. Behind him, Richard Coleman leaned forward, curiosity finally overcoming his earlier indifference. Margaret watched Thomas's face change, the way his eyes narrowed, the way his jaw tightened, not in anger, but recognition. Thomas looked up at Charles. "Mr. Bennett, are you associated with Bennett Systems?" The question cut through the cabin like a dropped glass. Karen's head snapped toward him. Richard frowned. Margaret inhaled sharply. Charles didn't answer right away. He glanced down, then back up, as if weighing something private. "I founded it," he said. The silence that followed was different from before. Not tense, disoriented, as if the room had tilted slightly and everyone was trying to regain their footing. Thomas exhaled slowly. He knew Bennett Systems. Every airline supervisor did. Reservation architecture, security integration, data redundancy. The quiet infrastructure no one noticed until it failed. Karen's face drained of color, then flushed again. "That doesn't change the procedure," she said quickly. Too quickly. "We can't just take someone's word." Thomas didn't look at her. His eyes were still on Charles, studying him now with new focus. "I'll need to confirm through operations," he said. "Of course," Charles replied. The calmness unsettled her more than anger would have. Thomas stepped into the galley and made a call. Low voice, short sentences, names spoken carefully. The cabin waited. The engines idled. Outside, a baggage cart beeped somewhere in the distance. Richard shifted again, clearing his throat. "So, you run some tech company," he said, trying to sound casual. "That still doesn't mean," Charles turned toward him then. Not sharply, just enough. "It means I'm used to being questioned," he said. "And I'm tired of pretending it's always about systems." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked away, suddenly very interested in the safety card. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. She had heard that tone before. From students, from colleagues, from men who had learned to choose their words carefully because the cost of honesty was always higher for them. Thomas returned. His face was set now, professional, controlled. "Operations confirmed," he said. "Mr. Bennett is listed as a key vendor contact. His credentials are verified." Karen stared at him. "So what? We just ignore the discrepancy?" "There is no discrepancy," Thomas replied. His voice was firm, but not raised. "There was a misinterpretation." Karen swallowed. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty crept into her expression. Not guilt, not yet. Fear. The kind that came when a person realized the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they believed. "I was following protocol," she said, "based on experience." Thomas finally turned to her. "Experience doesn't override evidence." The words landed with finality. Around them, the cabin seemed to breathe again. A woman in the second row relaxed her shoulders. Someone behind let out a quiet sigh. Margaret pressed stop on the recorder, but didn't put her phone away. Not yet. "Mr. Bennett," Thomas said, "you're cleared to remain in your seat. I apologize for the inconvenience." Charles nodded. "Thank you." No triumph, no smile, just acknowledgement. Karen stood frozen, caught between relief and humiliation. She wanted to say something, anything, to explain, to defend, to rewind the last 15 minutes. Instead, she said nothing. Thomas lowered his voice. "Karen, step into the galley with me." She followed, heels unsteady now. The curtain slid shut behind them, muffling their voices, but not the weight of what had happened. Richard sat back slowly. He felt exposed, though no one was looking directly at him. He replayed his earlier words in his head. "They don't just pick people at random." The sentence sounded uglier now, smaller. He wondered how many times he had said something like that without consequence. Margaret leaned toward Charles slightly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for the way this started." Charles met her eyes. There was weariness there, but also something gentler. "Thank you," he said, "for noticing." The curtain parted. Thomas emerged alone. Karen did not. He addressed the cabin, voice clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be departing shortly." No explanation, no spectacle, just professionalism reasserted. As he moved away, Charles allowed himself a single breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands trembled faintly, then steadied. He hated that part. The delayed reaction, the quiet aftermath no one ever saw. The engines began to spool louder. Outside, the jet bridge pulled back. The door closed with a solid thud. Karen returned to her jump seat at the front, eyes forward, jaw set. She did not look at Charles again. In her mind, the moment replayed in fragments. The look on Thomas's face. The way the cabin had shifted. The realization that she might not be protected by procedure after all. Margaret watched her, not with anger, but with a sad clarity. She had seen this before too. The instant when a person realized they had crossed a line and didn't know how to step back. As the plane began to taxi, Charles stared out the window at the blurred lights of the runway. He thought of his father, who had taught him to keep receipts, to document everything, to stay calm, no matter how unfair the situation felt. He thought of all the men who had not been given the chance to explain themselves. This wasn't over. He knew that. Not really. What had happened in this cabin would ripple outward. Paperwork, meetings, decisions made in rooms far from this plane. The aircraft turned, lining up for takeoff. The cabin grew quiet again. But it was a different quiet now. Heavier. Thoughtful. As the wheels lifted from the ground, Charles closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the vibration run through him. Above the clouds, the air would be smooth, but down below, consequences were already taking shape. The first tremor hit 30 minutes after takeoff. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived as a subtle shift in the cabin, a tightening in posture, a glance held half a second too long. Thomas Reed felt it before anyone else. He had learned, over decades in the air, the trouble rarely came shouting. It came whispering. He stood near the forward galley, reviewing a routine checklist on his tablet, when the message came through his earpiece. Operations, low priority flag, vendor inquiry. The kind of thing that usually waited until landing, except this one didn't. Thomas read the line twice, then a third time. His pulse quickened. Not panic, recognition. He turned slightly, angling his body away from the cabin, as if that could shield the weight of what he'd just seen. Across the aisle, Karen Whitfield sat rigid in her jump seat. She had not moved since takeoff. Her hands were folded too tightly in her lap. She stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, replaying every second. She told herself she had done nothing malicious. That intent mattered. That experience mattered. But the words sounded thinner each time she repeated them. In seat 1A, Charles Bennett felt the change as well. He sensed it the way some people sensed pressure shifts in their joints before a storm. He didn't look up. He already knew. Thomas stepped toward him, lowering his voice. "Mr. Bennett, may I speak with you privately?" Charles nodded and unbuckled. The simple click of the seatbelt echoed louder than it should have. A few heads turned. Margaret Lewis watched them disappear behind the curtain, her stomach tightening again. In the galley, the hum of machinery filled the space. Thomas closed the curtain halfway, enough to create separation without drawing attention. "Operations received a call," he said, "from corporate compliance." Charles waited. He had learned long ago that people spoke more freely when they weren't rushed. "They want a preliminary report," Thomas continued, "immediately. They're concerned this may escalate." Charles studied him. Concerned about what? Thomas hesitated. That was answer enough. "Exposure," he said finally. "Legal. Reputational." Charles nodded once. "Then it already has." Thomas exhaled. "There's something else." He turned the tablet toward Charles. Bennett Systems access logs flagged unusual activity. That caught Charles's attention. He leaned in slightly, not alarmed, focused. "Define unusual." "Internal checks," Thomas said. "Triggered after your name came up. Someone in Liberty Air's technology division tried to review vendor oversight protocols mid-flight." Charles let that sink in. The corners of his mouth tightened, not in anger, but calculation. "They're trying to get ahead of it," he said, "or bury it." Thomas didn't argue. Out in the cabin, Richard Coleman shifted in his seat again. He had been replaying the moment Thomas asked about Bennett Systems. The look on Karen's face, the quiet certainty in Charles's voice. Something unsettled him. He had spent a lifetime believing that if you followed the rules, the system protected you. Now he wasn't so sure who the system protected at all. Margaret leaned towards the aisle, watching the curtain. She felt the urge to stand, to check on Charles, then stopped herself. She had learned that sometimes support meant restraint, witnessing, being ready when it mattered. Karen felt her earpiece vibrate, a message she hadn't expected. Compliance review pending, temporary removal from service under consideration. Her throat went dry. Temporary, pending. Words that sounded procedural but felt like a verdict. She swallowed hard, the first real crack in her composure. She thought of her mortgage, her custody schedule. The years she had spent telling herself that professionalism kept you safe. In the galley, Thomas lowered his voice further. "Corporate wants to know if you intend to file a formal complaint." Charles didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands. They were steady now. He remembered when they hadn't been. He remembered a younger version of himself standing in an airport security line, being pulled aside again, told again that it was random. "I haven't decided," he said. "This isn't about paperwork." Thomas nodded. "I understand." "No," Charles corrected gently. "You don't. Not fully. But I appreciate the effort." Thomas accepted that. He had learned when to listen. They returned to their seats. The curtains slid open. A few passengers pretended not to watch. Others didn't bother. The mood had shifted again. The earlier tension had been replaced by something heavier. Anticipation. Karen avoided Charles's eyes as he passed. He didn't look at her either. Not out of spite. Out of exhaustion. As the plane leveled off, a soft chime sounded. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at altitude. Expect a smooth ride." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Smooth ride. She almost laughed at the irony. Minutes later, Thomas returned to the aisle, this time with a different posture. Straighter, more formal. He stopped beside Karen's seat. "Karen," he said quietly, "I need you to step out of service for the remainder of the flight." Her head snapped up. You can't be serious. I am, he replied. This is not a disciplinary action. It's a procedural safeguard. The words were careful, designed to de-escalate, but the damage was done. Several passengers heard. Richard felt a flush creep up his neck. This wasn't just awkward anymore. This was real. Karen stood slowly, legs unsteady. She glanced at Charles then, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a problem, as a person. The realization hit too late. Her mouth opened, then closed. There were no words that could undo what had already been said. She moved toward the rear of the aircraft, escorted not by security, but by silence. Margaret watched her go, heart heavy. Consequences mattered, yes, but so did understanding. She wondered which would come first. Charles remained seated. He felt the familiar tug of conflicting emotions. Relief, sadness, a quiet anger he kept buried deep. He knew this wasn't over. He also knew something had already changed. Thomas paused beside him. For what it's worth, he said, this will be reviewed thoroughly. Charles looked up. For whose sake? Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The cabin settled into a fragile calm. Drinks were served by another attendant, careful, overly polite. Conversations resumed, subdued. Richard stared out the window, replaying his own words again, wishing he could pull them back. Margaret took out her phone, not to record this time, but to type a message to her daughter. Just a few lines. Something about speaking up, about watching closely. Charles leaned back and closed his eyes, not to rest, to think. He felt the weight of choice pressing in. Whatever came next would not stay contained in this cabin. Systems had memories, people had receipts, and sometimes silence was no longer an option. The call reached the cockpit before the cabin felt its full weight. Captain Harold Mason had been flying commercial aircraft for nearly 4 decades, 61 years old, former Air Force, a man who believed deeply in procedure, hierarchy, and the quiet discipline that kept metal birds in the sky. When his headset crackled with a message flagged Priority Red, he frowned. That designation was rare. It bypassed routine channels. It meant lawyers were listening. Captain, the voice said, controlled but urgent. This is corporate compliance. We need a status update on the situation involving passenger Charles Bennett. Mason's eyes flicked toward the closed cockpit door. Beyond it, the cabin. Beyond that, consequences he could already feel forming. I was briefed on a seating dispute, he said. My supervisor handled it. Yes, sir, we're aware. This has moved beyond a routine dispute. Mason paused. In his long career, there were only a handful of times he'd heard that phrase. None of them ended quietly. Understood, he said. What do you need from me? Containment, the voice replied. Documentation. And no deviations from protocol. When the line went dead, Mason sat back, jaw tight. He stared at the instruments in front of him, numbers glowing steady and obedient. Planes were honest. They responded to inputs. People did not. In the cabin, Thomas Reed felt the shift almost immediately. A subtle change in how the crew moved. Fewer smiles, shorter steps. He watched a junior attendant glance at Karen Whitfield's empty jump seat, then quickly look away. Fear spread faster than rumors ever did. Thomas walked down the aisle, checking on passengers, his demeanor calm, practiced. When he reached row 1, Charles Bennett looked up at him, eyes sharp now. Not wary, assessing. They've called the cockpit, Charles said quietly. Thomas didn't deny it. Yes. So it's begun, Charles replied. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman pretended to read the in-flight magazine, though the same page had been open for nearly 10 minutes. His mind churned. He had seen men escorted off planes before. Loud men, drunk men, angry men. He had never seen a woman quietly removed from duty for what she believed was enforcing order. For the first time, it occurred to him that order and fairness were not always the same thing. The thought unsettled him more than turbulence ever could. Margaret Lewis watched the cabin with a teacher's eye, the way she used to watch a classroom, right before something broke open. She noticed the tension in the crew's shoulders, the careful politeness, the way no one quite met Charles's gaze anymore. Respect, yes, but also distance, as if proximity itself carried risk. She thought of her students years ago, when discussions about fairness became uncomfortable, when silence was easier than reflection. She wondered how many of the people around her would later say they had sensed something was wrong all along. A chime sounded softly. Thomas leaned down toward Charles. "Captain Mason would like to speak with you," he said, "at your convenience." Charles considered the words. At your convenience. He almost smiled at the irony. "Now is fine," he said. They walked forward together. The cockpit door opened with a muted hiss. Captain Mason turned in his seat, removing his headset. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried weight. "Mr. Bennett," Mason said, extending a hand. "Captain Mason." Charles shook it. Firm, respectful. "Captain." Mason gestured to the jump seat. "Please." As Charles sat, Mason closed the door behind them. The cockpit felt smaller than the cabin, more intimate, more honest. There was no audience here, no performative professionalism, just two men, each aware that the next few minutes mattered. "I've been briefed," Mason said. "Partially." Charles waited. "There was an interaction," Mason continued. "Our crew acted based on their judgment. That judgment is now under review." Charles looked at the instruments, the steady lines, the quiet authority of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. "Judgment is a powerful thing," he said. "It's rarely neutral." Mason nodded slowly. "I've flown long enough to know that." There was a pause. Not awkward, deliberate. "I need to ask you directly," Mason said. "Do you feel you were treated unfairly?" Charles turned to him then, not defensive, not angry, tired. "Yes," he said. The simplicity of the answer hit harder than any accusation. Mason exhaled. He thought of his daughters, of the speeches he'd given to new pilots about professionalism, of the pride he took in running a tight ship. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth something," Charles replied, "just not enough." Mason accepted that without protest. "Corporate will want statements," he said. "There will be meetings, reviews. I can't promise outcomes." "I'm not asking for promises," Charles said. "I'm asking for honesty." Mason met his gaze. "You have it." When Charles returned to his seat, the cabin felt different again, quieter, heavier. Margaret sensed it immediately. She watched his face, searching for clues. He gave none. He simply sat, folded his hands, and stared forward. Minutes passed, then more. The plane cut through smooth air, indifferent to human complexity. In the rear galley, Karen Whitfield sat alone. No announcements, no instructions, just waiting. Her phone buzzed once with a message she was not authorized to read yet. Pending review. The words blurred. She pressed her palms together, trying to slow her breathing. She replayed the moment again and again. The look on his face. The way she had dismissed the boarding pass. She told herself she had seen patterns before. She told herself patterns existed for a reason. But doubt had begun to gnaw at her, relentless. Back in first class, Richard finally leaned toward Charles. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. His voice lacked its earlier certainty. "I made assumptions." Charles studied him. "We all do," he said. "The problem is who pays for them." Richard nodded, shame creeping into his posture. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't try to soften it. For a man of his generation, that alone was something. Margaret smiled faintly, then looked away, careful not to intrude. Another chime. Thomas Reed's voice came over the cabin speakers, controlled but deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are addressing an internal matter and will continue with normal service." Normal service. The phrase rang hollow. There was nothing normal about what was unfolding. Charles closed his eyes briefly. He felt the familiar pull again, the choice that always came next. He could let this resolve quietly, accept apologies, allow the system to reset without friction. Or he could press. Not for himself, for the people who never got the chance to sit in this seat, to speak in this cockpit, to be heard without raising their voice. The decision settled in his chest, heavy but clear. The flight was steady. The path ahead was not. The message reached Charles Bennett as a vibration against his wrist, faint but deliberate. Not an alert, not an alarm. A signal he had designed years ago for moments when silence mattered more than speed. He didn't look at it right away. He waited, counted his breaths, listened to the steady rush of air moving past the fuselage. Only then did he glance down. One line of text. Internal audit flag activated. Liberty Air compliance escalation confirmed. External counsel looped in. He closed his eyes again. Not because he was overwhelmed, because he was calculating. In the cockpit, Captain Mason received a second call. This one carried a different tone, less cautious, more directive. "Captain, this is legal. We need to understand the passenger's intent. Is Mr. Bennett pursuing action?" Mason chose his words carefully. "He hasn't stated that. Yet," the voice replied. Mason ended the call and stared out at the dark sky. He had flown through storms that rattled the airframe and menaced the instruments. This felt worse. Storms were honest. This was not. In the cabin, Thomas Reed felt the weight settle into his shoulders. He had just finished a quiet exchange with a junior attendant who asked, too carefully, whether they were in trouble. He hadn't answered. He knew better than to lie. Margaret Lewis watched Charles from across the aisle. She noticed the subtle shift in him, the way his posture changed. Not tense, resolute, like a man who had made up his mind and was now waiting for the world to catch up. She thought of the moment years ago when she had finally confronted a school board over a quietly discriminatory policy. How small it had seemed at the time, how large it felt later. Richard Coleman stared at his hands. He had spent the last 20 minutes replaying his apology, wondering if it had been enough, wondering if there even was such a thing as enough. He realized, with a quiet discomfort, that he had benefited from silence his entire life. The first visible consequence arrived not with drama, but with procedure. A senior flight attendant from the rear cabin approached Thomas and spoke in a low voice. Thomas nodded once, then turned toward the front. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, leaning into the aisle rather than using the intercom. "We will be making a brief notation regarding crew assignments. Service will continue as scheduled." Karen Whitfield's name was not mentioned. It didn't need to be. The absence spoke loudly enough. In the rear galley, Karen sat alone, staring at the metal wall. She had stopped trying to justify her actions. The explanations had fallen apart one by one. What remained was something harder to face. The possibility that she had confused familiarity with fairness. That she had mistaken control for professionalism. Her phone buzzed again. This time the message opened. Temporary suspension pending investigation. Effective immediately. She felt the words before she understood them. A hollow pressure in her chest. A narrowing of vision. She thought of the younger version of herself, stepping onto her first flight in uniform, believing she was part of something honorable. She wondered when that belief had turned brittle. Up front, Charles leaned slightly toward the aisle as Thomas passed again. "They're moving fast," Charles said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Faster than I've ever seen." "Speed usually means fear," Charles replied. Thomas didn't disagree. "They're worried about exposure." "They should be," Charles said. "Not as a threat, as an observation." A subtle tremor passed through the cabin. Not turbulence. Human. The kind that came when people realized they were inside something larger than themselves. Phones remained mostly tucked away, but attention sharpened. Whispers moved like static. Margaret's phone vibrated. A message from her daughter. "How's your flight?" She stared at the screen, then typed slowly. "Uneventful. Just thinking a lot." In the cockpit, Mason made a decision. He requested a secure line to headquarters. When it connected, he spoke without preamble. "We have a situation that requires more than containment." The pause on the other end told him everything. "Captain," the voice said, "this needs to stay on board." Mason's jaw tightened. "With respect, that's no longer possible." Silence. Then, reluctantly, "We'll brief executive leadership." Mason ended the call. He felt older than he had an hour ago. Back in first class, Charles stared out at the blackness beyond the window. He remembered his father's voice, low and steady, telling him that systems didn't fail people by accident. They failed them by design. He remembered promising himself that if he ever had leverage, real leverage, he would use it responsibly. Responsibly didn't mean quietly. Thomas returned once more, this time pulling the curtain just enough to speak without being overheard. "Mr. Bennett, corporate would like to know if you're willing to participate in a post-flight review." Charles looked at him. "Define review." "Statements, interviews, internal findings." "And consequences?" Charles asked. Thomas hesitated. "That depends." "On what?" "On how far this goes." Charles nodded. "Then I think it's already gone far enough." Thomas studied him. "Are you saying you intend to escalate?" Charles's gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying I won't contain it." The words hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. Across the aisle, Richard caught fragments of the exchange. He didn't hear the words, but he saw the shift in Thomas's face. The realization settled uncomfortably in his gut. He had boarded this flight expecting nothing more than a quiet evening and a drink in a real glass. He was about to land in a very different world. Margaret felt it too. She straightened in her seat, a familiar resolve settling into her bones. Whatever happened next, she would not forget it, and she would not pretend she hadn't seen it. In the rear, Karen closed her eyes. The plane hummed around her, indifferent. She wondered if anyone would ever understand how easy it had been to believe she was doing the right thing, how seductive certainty could be. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Outside, the first hint of dawn traced a thin line along the horizon. Charles checked his watch. Not for the time, for alignment. Everything was moving now. Lawyers, executives, systems he had helped build, responding in ways no one could fully control. He took one more breath, deep and steady. This was no longer about a seat. It was about what happened when quiet injustice met quiet authority, and which one would finally be forced to speak. The first hint of morning slid along the horizon like a thin blade of light, pale and unforgiving. It crept through the windows of the first-class cabin, touching faces that had not slept, illuminating expressions that had changed quietly in the dark. Charles Bennett felt it before he saw it. The subtle shift in the air, the sense that decisions had already been made somewhere far above this aircraft, in rooms without windows, by people who would never set foot in this aisle. He straightened slightly, shoulders squared, not in defiance but readiness. Thomas Reed returned to the front, his expression composed but tight. He had received 3 messages in the last 10 minutes, each one shorter than the last, each one more direct. When organizations panicked, language always collapsed first. "Mr. Bennett," Thomas said softly, leaning in. "Executive leadership has been briefed." Charles did not react. That was inevitable. "They're requesting a live call after landing," Thomas continued. "Legal, compliance, public relations." "And you?" Charles asked. Thomas hesitated. That pause was the answer. "I'm requesting clarity," he said finally. "For myself." Charles studied him, not as an adversary, not as an ally, as a man standing at the edge of a system, deciding whether to step back or step forward. "Clarity rarely comes from silence," Charles said. Thomas nodded once. "I know." Across the aisle, Richard Coleman sat rigid, hands folded, eyes fixed on the seatback screen he wasn't watching. He had lived his life believing that if you kept your head down and followed the rules, storms passed over you. Now, he realized, storms passed because someone else absorbed the damage. The discomfort settled deep in his chest, heavy and unfamiliar. Margaret Lewis watched the exchange with careful attention. She had seen this moment before, though never at 30,000 feet. The moment when authority hesitated, when conscience knocked softly, asking to be let in. She had learned that this moment never announced itself. It whispered, and most people ignored it. The intercom chimed, gentle but insistent. Captain Mason's voice followed, calm yet weighted. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Routine words, extraordinary circumstances. In the rear of the cabin, Karen Whitfield sat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Her uniform felt heavier now, like it belonged to someone else. She had stopped checking her phone. There were no new messages, only the echo of the last one. Temporary suspension, pending investigation. She stared at the floor and replayed the moment Thomas had said her name. The way his voice had changed. The way the cabin had felt suddenly colder. She had always believed consequences came from mistakes, not intentions. Now she wondered if intent mattered at all once harm was done. The aircraft began its descent, a gentle dip that pressed bodies into seats. The city below emerged from the darkness, grids of light stretching endlessly, indifferent to the drama unfolding above. Thomas moved down the aisle, checking belts, murmuring rehearsed reassurances. When he reached Margaret, she caught his sleeve lightly, not to stop him, just to be seen. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For not pretending this was nothing," Margaret replied. He swallowed. "I don't know how this ends." "Neither did most of my students," she said. That never stopped the lesson. He nodded and moved on, carrying the weight of her words with him. As the plane leveled briefly, Charles closed his eyes. He thought of the first time he had been called difficult for asking a question. The first time he had been advised, gently, to let something go. He had learned then that the cost of letting go was cumulative. It added up quietly, until one day you realized you had given away too much. The wheels hit the runway with a muted thud. The cabin jolted. Applause did not follow. No one clapped. It felt inappropriate now, almost disrespectful. The plane slowed, engines roaring, then softened into a taxiing hum. Phones buzzed to life as soon as the seatbelt sign flickered off. Messages poured in. Missed calls, alerts. Somewhere, someone had already started writing a narrative. Thomas stood at the front, blocking the aisle gently but firmly. "Please remain seated," he said.
"We'll be disembarking shortly."
Charles stayed where he was. He felt eyes on him, not hostile now, but searching, expectant, as if he were holding something fragile that might break if mishandled. The door opened. Morning air rushed in, crisp and cool. The jet bridge connected with a hollow clank. Two men in dark suits appeared at the threshold, not wearing airline uniforms. Their expressions were polite, practiced, unreadable. "Mr. Bennett?" one asked. Charles stood. The movement was small, but it rippled through the cabin. Conversations died. Even Richard looked up, heart pounding. "Yes," Charles said. "I'm David Harper," the man continued. "Corporate compliance. May we speak with you?" Charles glanced once around the cabin, at Margaret, at Richard, at Thomas, at Karen, still seated in the rear, eyes lowered. He saw not villains or heroes, but people caught in the machinery of a system that rewarded comfort over courage. "Here," Charles said. They heard it too. Harper hesitated. "That wasn't the script. We were hoping for privacy." "You've had privacy for decades," Charles replied. His voice was calm, but it carried. "This happened in public." A murmur moved through the cabin. Margaret's hand trembled slightly, though she kept it in her lap. Richard felt something break open inside him. Shame, yes, but also relief. Harper nodded slowly. "Very well." Charles did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What occurred on this flight was not a misunderstanding," he said. "It was a decision. A series of decisions made easier by assumption and defended by procedure. If you want this to end quietly, it won't. If you want it to end honestly, I'm listening." Silence followed. Not the tense kind, the kind that forced reckoning. Thomas felt it then. The shift he would remember for the rest of his career. The moment when authority ceded ground to truth. Harper cleared his throat. "We are prepared to initiate a formal review," he said, "including immediate policy assessment and external oversight." Charles nodded. "That's a start." In the rear, Karen closed her eyes. Tears gathered, uninvited. Not for herself alone, for the certainty she had lost. For the ease with which she had once believed she was right. Richard leaned forward slightly. "If statements are being taken," he said, voice unsteady but firm, "I have one." Margaret looked at him, surprised, then proud. Charles met Richard's gaze. "Good," he said, "because silence is what got us here." The cabin felt different now. Lighter, somehow. Not resolved, not healed, but awake. As passengers began to stand, gathering their belongings, Charles remained where he was for a moment longer. He breathed in the smell of coffee drifting from the terminal, the sound of footsteps on metal, the low murmur of 100 private reckonings. This was only the beginning. He knew that. Systems did not change because one man stood up. They changed because standing up became contagious. He stepped into the aisle, not as a passenger claiming a seat, but as a man refusing to give ground ever again. The corridor outside the aircraft was colder than Charles expected. Not temperature, presence. The kind of chill that came from fluorescent lights, polished floors, and people trained to keep their expressions neutral no matter what they carried inside. They walked him past the gate desk without ceremony. No handcuffs, no escorts gripping his arms. Just distance, intentional space, corporate courtesy at its most practiced. David Harper stayed half a step ahead, phone already pressed to his ear, murmuring updates to someone who wasn't listening so much as counting risk. Behind them, the cabin emptied slowly. Passengers emerged in clusters, voices low, eyes darting. Some pretended nothing had happened. Others looked around as if they had just stepped out of a courtroom and weren't sure what verdict had been reached. Margaret Lewis exited near the middle. She caught sight of Charles, standing near the glass wall that overlooked the tarmac, flanked by suits. Their eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod. She returned it, her throat tight. That nod meant more than applause ever could. Richard Coleman lingered at the end of the jet bridge. He almost walked past, almost chose the easier path. Then he stopped, turned, approached David Harper with a stiffness that betrayed his nerves. "I said I have a statement," Richard said. His voice was steady now, not confident, but committed. Harper looked at him with mild surprise. "Sir, we'll be gathering information through proper channels." "This is a proper channel," Richard replied. "I was there." Harper hesitated, then nodded once. "We'll take your contact information." Richard exhaled. It wasn't justice, but it was movement. Thomas Reed stood a few feet away, arms crossed loosely, watching the exchange. His badge felt heavier than usual against his chest. He had received a message moments ago from his regional director. "You did the right thing. Stand by." Stand by. The phrase felt inadequate, but he took it anyway. Karen Whitfield was the last to leave the aircraft. She walked alone, uniform immaculate, posture rigid, as if discipline alone could hold her together. No one spoke to her. No one needed to. The silence followed her like a shadow. She stopped near the end of the corridor when she saw Charles again. For a moment, she considered turning away. Habit urged her to keep moving. Training told her not to engage. But something else, newer and more uncomfortable, held her in place. "Mr. Bennett," she said quietly. Charles turned. He did not soften. He did not harden either. He simply waited. "I need to say this," Karen continued. Her voice trembled despite her effort to control it. "I thought I was enforcing standards. I didn't see how much of that came from my own assumptions." She swallowed. "I'm sorry." The word landed between them, fragile and exposed. Charles studied her for a long moment. He thought of all the apologies he had never received, or the ones that came too late. He did not absolve her. He did not reject her either. "I believe you're sorry now," he said. "The question is, what you do with that after today." Karen nodded, tears welling despite her resolve. "I don't know yet." "Figure it out," Charles said. "That work matters." She stepped back, as if released, and walked away. Her shoulders slumped for the first time. David Harper cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennett, executive leadership is ready to speak with you. They're assembling a call now." Charles glanced at the terminal windows, at the planes taxiing, lifting, landing. The machinery of movement never stopped. "Here," he said again. "We do it here." Harper hesitated. "This is highly sensitive." "So is what happened," Charles replied. Within minutes, a small conference room off the concourse was commandeered. Glass walls, a long table, a screen flickering to life at one end. Faces appeared one by one. Executives, legal counsel, communications, all carefully composed, all very aware of the stakes. "Mr. Bennett," a woman in her late 50s, said from the screen, "I'm Elaine Foster, Chief Operations Officer. On behalf of Liberty Air, I want to apologize." Charles leaned back in his chair. "Apologies are easy," he said. "They cost nothing." A murmur rippled across the screen. Elaine held his gaze. "We are prepared to initiate immediate corrective measures." "Define immediate," Charles replied. "Suspension of involved personnel pending investigation. External review of training protocols. A public statement acknowledging failure." Charles nodded slowly. "That's containment," he said, "not correction." Silence followed. This time it was not comfortable. Margaret stood just outside the room, pretending to look for directions while listening. Thomas stood beside her, arms folded, jaw set. Richard hovered nearby, hands clasped, waiting for his turn. "What do you want, Mr. Bennet?" Elaine asked finally. Charles leaned forward. His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "I want you to stop treating incidents like this as anomalies. They're not. They're symptoms. Of culture, of incentives, of who gets believed and who doesn't." He paused, letting the words settle. "I want independent oversight, not internal audits. I want real authority given to people who can intervene before harm is done. And I want transparency when you fail." Elaine exchanged glances with others off-screen. "That would be unprecedented." "So was what happened on that plane," Charles replied. Another executive spoke up. "This could expose us to significant liability." Charles met the camera. "You're already exposed. The question is whether you'll do anything meaningful with it." Minutes passed. Arguments rose and fell. Risk calculations were made. PR strategies proposed and discarded. Through it all, Charles remained steady, not demanding, insistent. Finally, Elaine spoke again. "We will convene an emergency board session within 24 hours, she said. "We will invite external civil rights consultants, and we will issue a statement acknowledging systemic failure." Charles nodded once. "I'll hold you to that." The call ended. The screen went dark. The room felt suddenly very small. Outside, Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I taught civics for 30 years, she said quietly to Thomas. "I've never seen accountability happen this close." Thomas nodded. "Neither have I." Richard stepped forward. "If they're taking statements," he said, "I'm ready." David Harper looked at him, then at Charles. "We'll arrange it." As they exited the room, the terminal buzzed with ordinary life. Coffee cups, rolling suitcases, departures and arrivals. No banners, no headlines yet. Just the quiet, before something larger broke loose. Charles paused near the windows again. He watched a Liberty airplane lift into the sky, engines roaring, carrying hundreds of people who would never know his name. That was fine. This had never been about recognition. Margaret approached him one last time. "You changed something today," she said. Charles shook his head. "No," he replied. "I just refused to let it stay hidden." As they went their separate ways, each carried something new. Karen carried reckoning. Richard carried responsibility. Thomas carried resolve. Margaret carried a story she would tell carefully, truthfully, to anyone willing to listen. And Charles Bennet walked into the terminal, alone. Not triumphant, not defeated, but certain of one thing. Systems didn't change because they were asked politely. They changed because someone stood still when everything around them expected compliance. The news did not break with sirens or headlines. It crept outward, quiet at first, moving through inboxes, internal memos, and closed-door meetings before it ever reached the public. That was how institutions preferred it. Controlled, managed. But control was already slipping. Charles Bennet felt at the moment his phone began to vibrate again, this time not with internal alerts, but names he hadn't seen in years. Former colleagues, industry peers, a senator's chief of staff. The pattern was familiar. When power sensed exposure, it sought proximity. He stood near a large window overlooking the concourse, watching travelers move in steady currents, unaware that decisions made in rooms like this shaped their days more than weather ever could. He let the calls go unanswered for now. Timing mattered. Thomas Reed remained nearby, officially on duty, unofficially on alert. He had been instructed to document everything, every interaction, every word. He had complied, but he also understood something else now. Documentation was not just protection. It was memory. Karen Whitfield sat in a small office off the terminal, waiting. No phone, no instructions. Just a chair and the hum of air conditioning. She had replayed the conversation with Charles again and again. His refusal to condemn her outright unsettled her more than anger would have. It left room for responsibility, and responsibility was heavier than blame. Richard Coleman was halfway to the parking garage when he turned back. He couldn't leave yet, not without finishing something. He found a customer service desk and asked, calmly, where he could submit a formal statement regarding an in-flight incident. The young agent blinked, then nodded, pointing him toward a hallway he had walked past dozens of times without noticing. Margaret Lewis sat on a bench near the gate, her carry-on at her feet, hands folded. She had missed her connecting flight. She hadn't told anyone. She wasn't in a hurry anymore. She was thinking about how easily moments passed when no one insisted on holding them still. The first public statement from Liberty Air arrived just under 2 hours later. Carefully worded, regretful, vague, an acknowledgement of concern without naming harm. It circulated internally first, then externally, framed as proactive transparency. Charles read it once, then again. He handed his phone to Thomas. "This won't hold," he said. Thomas scanned the message, then nodded. "They're trying to buy time." "Time buys silence," Charles replied. "Not change." Within minutes, a second wave hit. A journalist Charles respected, one who specialized in corporate accountability, sent a single line. "Hearing things. Want comment?" Charles typed back. "Not yet, but soon." In a boardroom across the city, Liberty Air's executive team gathered around a long table, tension thick enough to taste. Some stared at screens, others stared at nothing. Elaine Foster sat at the head, hands clasped, eyes sharp. "This will not stay internal," she said. "We need to decide whether we lead or get dragged." Legal counsel cleared his throat. "Leading increases exposure." Elaine didn't look at him. "So does lying." Silence followed. Not agreement. Calculation. Back at the airport, David Harper returned to Charles with a tight expression. "The board is divided," he said. "There's resistance." "Of course there is," Charles replied. "Resistance is the system defending itself." Harper hesitated. "They're asking what it would take for you to hold off on public engagement." Charles looked at him steadily. "That question tells me everything I need to know." He stepped away, pulling out his phone. He dialed a number he had memorized long ago but rarely used. When the voice on the other end answered, he spoke plainly. "It's happening. I'm ready." The journalist arrived faster than expected. Mid-40s, no camera crew, just a recorder and a notebook worn soft at the edges. They sat at a small cafe overlooking the terminal. Travelers passed by, unaware they were walking through the opening chapter of a larger reckoning. Charles spoke without embellishment. He described the facts, the decisions, the silences. He named no villains. He didn't need to. Systems revealed themselves through patterns, not personalities. The journalist listened, asked precise questions, then nodded slowly. "This isn't just about a flight," she said. "No," Charles replied. "It's about who gets challenged and who doesn't." By the time the article went live, Liberty Air's internal channels were already unraveling. Employees began sharing stories, not publicly at first, in emails, in break rooms, then louder. Patterns emerging where management had insisted none existed. Karen Whitfield read the article on a screen she hadn't been allowed to log into an hour earlier. Someone had left it open. She recognized herself between the lines, not as a villain, as a warning. Her chest tightened. She wondered whether she would ever be trusted again, and whether trust, once broken, could be rebuilt honestly. Richard Coleman submitted his statement. 3 pages, handwritten. He surprised himself with how much he wrote, the assumptions he named, the comfort he questioned. When he finished, his hands shook. He felt lighter, anyway. Margaret finally stood and walked toward the exit. As she passed the cafe, she saw Charles mid-conversation, his posture relaxed but alert. She smiled to herself. Some lessons were taught with chalk and desks. Others unfolded at altitude. That evening, Liberty Air's stock dipped. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. Analysts called it market correction. Insiders called it the cost of denial. Elaine Foster stood before the board again, this time with fewer arguments and more resolve. "We can't undo what happened," she said, "but we can decide what it becomes." The vote was not unanimous. It didn't need to be. Change rarely was. As night fell, Charles left the terminal alone. No escort, no cameras, just the weight of what he had set in motion. He knew tomorrow would bring backlash, accusations, quiet threats dressed up as concern. He also knew something else. For the first time in a long while, the system had been forced to look at itself without the comfort of denial. He stepped into the cool evening air and breathed deeply. This was not the end. It was the point of no return. The morning arrived without relief. No quiet reset. No sense that the storm had passed. If anything, the air felt heavier, as if the night had only given the tension time to gather weight. Charles Bennett watched the sunrise from a hotel window overlooking the Hudson, the light breaking in pale bands across the water. He had not slept. Sleep required believing that things would pause if you closed your eyes. He knew better. Systems did not pause. They adapted. His phone vibrated on the table. Not a call. An internal alert. Liberty Air employee forum traffic had surged overnight. Not complaints. Confessions. Gate agents, cabin crew, regional managers. Stories stacking on top of stories, forming a pattern no press release could smother. Thomas Reed knocked once, then entered. His jacket was creased, his eyes sharp. "Legal teams are mobilizing," he said. "Not just theirs. Others, competitors. Everyone's watching to see how far this goes." Charles didn't turn from the window. "They're afraid of precedent." "Yes," Thomas replied, "because precedent doesn't ask permission." Across the city, Karen Whitfield sat at her kitchen table, a mug of coffee untouched. She had called her sister at dawn and said only, "I think I lost my job." The silence on the other end had been worse than anger. Silence meant the world was already rearranging itself without her consent. She opened her laptop. Her employee access had been revoked. No message, no explanation, just absence. For the first time, she felt the full weight of the authority she had once wielded without question, now gone, leaving only the echo of decisions she could not take back. At Liberty Air headquarters, Elaine Foster stood before a wall of glass, watching the city move beneath her. She had slept 3 hours on the office couch. Her executive team sat scattered behind her, waiting, some nervous, some defensive, all aware that control was no longer theirs alone. "Legal wants delay," she said finally. "Public relations wants apology. Operations wants silence." "And you?" one board member asked. Elaine turned. Her voice was steady. "I want the truth on the table before it gets dragged there." A murmur moved through the room. Truth was expensive. Truth required naming failures without the shelter of euphemism. Meanwhile, the article had been shared again and again. Retired pilots commented beneath it, voices carrying decades of authority. Former flight attendants added quiet confirmations. A senator's office requested a briefing. A Transportation Oversight Committee scheduled a hearing, tentative but unmistakable. Richard Coleman sat in his car outside a grocery store, scrolling through comments on his phone. He recognized his own language in some of them. Not quoted, reflected. People admitting they had benefited from systems they never questioned. He felt exposed. Also relieved. Owning something was different from defending it. Margaret Lewis watched the coverage from her living room, wrapped in a cardigan her late husband used to tease her about. She paused the screen, staring at Charles Bennett's face, frozen mid-sentence. Calm, controlled, unflinching. She thought about all the moments in her life when she had stayed quiet because it seemed easier. She wondered how many of those moments had mattered more than she had allowed herself to believe. Back at the hotel, Charles met with a small group. No assistants, no recorders. Just people who understood leverage. Contracts. Long memory. You know they're digging into your background, one of them said, trying to find leverage. Charles nodded. They'll find complexity, not scandal. That hasn't stopped anyone before. No, Charles agreed, but it slows them down. A call came through, Elaine Foster. He stepped aside to take it. We need to speak, she said without preamble. We are, Charles replied. Not like this, she meant. With lawyers, with witnesses, with history watching. At Liberty Air, a draft statement sat on a screen. It named discrimination, used the word explicitly. Several executives objected. Too strong, too risky. Elaine stared at the word, as if it might blink first. If we can't name it, she said quietly, we can't fix it. The room went still. At the same moment, a transportation reporter published a follow-up piece. Internal memos leaked, training gaps documented. A former regional supervisor spoke on the record, describing how complaints had been minimized to protect metrics. The narrative was shifting from incident to infrastructure. Thomas Reed read the piece aloud in the hotel suite. They're no longer asking what happened, he said. They're asking why it was allowed to keep happening. Charles closed his eyes briefly. This was the turn. The point where stories stopped being isolated and became systemic. Karen Whitfield received an email. Formal. Impersonal. Notice of suspension pending investigation. No mention of context. No acknowledgement of complexity. Just consequence. She stared at the screen, anger rising. Then something else. Recognition. This was how the system protected itself, by narrowing blame until it fit inside one person. She began typing. Not a defense, an account. She described training that emphasized compliance over judgment, pressure to maintain order, the unspoken rules. She wrote until her hands ached. Then she sent it to a reporter whose name she had memorized overnight. In another part of the city, a coalition of civil rights groups drafted a joint statement. They cited the incident without naming individuals. They spoke of patterns, of age, of race, of quiet exclusions that compounded over time. They requested meetings, not outrage, accountability. Charles read their statement and nodded. This was no longer his alone. That mattered. Elaine Foster called again. This time her voice was different. Lower. More deliberate. We're prepared to acknowledge systemic failure, she said. But we need to know what comes next. Charles considered his answer carefully. What comes next isn't about me, he said. It's about whether you're willing to change the incentives that created this. Silence. Then, we are. He didn't respond immediately. Willingness was not commitment. By late afternoon, Liberty Air's stock dipped further. Analysts revised forecasts. Investors asked questions. The board scheduled an emergency session. Words like restructuring and oversight entered conversations that once avoided them. Margaret turned off the television and sat quietly. She thought about her grandchildren, about what kind of world they would inherit. She hoped this moment would be remembered not for who fell, but for what shifted. As evening settled, Charles returned to the window. The city lights flickered on, one by one. Somewhere below, planes lifted into darkening skies, their paths guided by systems most people never saw. He knew the next step would change everything. Names would be spoken, roles clarified, power exposed. This was the last moment before the truth became unavoidable. The hearing room was smaller than people expected. No grand marble columns, no dramatic flags, just wood, microphones, and the quiet weight of record-keeping. Charles Bennett took his seat without ceremony, hands folded, posture calm. He had spoken in boardrooms larger than this, rooms where decisions moved markets and ended careers. But this felt heavier. This room archived truth. Across the aisle, Elaine Foster sat straighter than usual, a binder open in front of her, pages marked with careful tabs. She had not slept well in days, not from fear of consequence, but from the slow realization that she had mistaken control for leadership for far too long. Karen Whitfield entered last. She paused at the doorway, eyes scanning the room, as if measuring the distance between who she had been and who she was now. She sat when directed, shoulders tense, jaw tight. This was not redemption. This was exposure. The committee chair spoke first. His voice was even, practiced, stripped of performance. He did not ask for drama. He asked for sequence. What happened? When? Who knew? Who decided? Charles listened as others spoke before him. Executives, managers, advisors. Each answer revealed a layer. Not malice in every place, not innocence either. More often, avoidance. Incentives misaligned, silence rewarded, accountability deferred until it no longer mattered. When Charles finally spoke, the room leaned in without realizing it. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He described. The moment on the aircraft, the words used, the reactions observed, the absence of intervention until pressure arrived from the outside. "I'm not here because I was harmed," he said. "I am here because what happened to me happens to others without consequence." No one interrupted. Karen was called next. She hesitated before speaking, then exhaled. Her testimony was not defensive. It was precise. She described training modules that emphasized order over empathy, metrics over judgment. She described the unspoken expectation to assert authority quickly, decisively, before questions could complicate control. "I thought I was doing my job," she said quietly. "I see now that my job was defined too narrowly." Elaine spoke last. Her voice carried the weight of someone who understood the cost of each word. She acknowledged failures, structural ones, cultural ones. She did not scapegoat. She did not minimize. She committed on record to changes already underway and others not yet announced. The room absorbed it all. This was not a spectacle. It was a pivot. Outside, the press waited. Cameras, microphones, sound bites hungry for simplicity. But the story resisted compression. It was not about one villain or one hero. It was about systems built without mirrors. When Charles stepped outside, the noise surged, then settled as he raised one hand. He spoke once more, briefly. He thanked witnesses. He named courage where it appeared. He emphasized that accountability without reform was theater. Reform without accountability was fiction. Then he left. No victory lap, no grin, just departure. Weeks passed. Quietly, then unmistakably, things changed. Liberty Air announced independent oversight, mandatory intervention authority for crew members witnessing bias, transparent reporting mechanisms accessible to passengers without escalation. Not promises, implementations, timelines, external audits. Other airlines followed, some willingly, some reluctantly, all publicly. The precedent had been set. Karen Whitfield did not return to aviation. She enrolled in mediation training, conflict resolution, bias recognition. She spoke once at a closed session for supervisors, not as an example of punishment, but of consequence. She did not seek forgiveness. She sought accuracy. Elaine Foster remained at her post, but her role shifted. Less insulation, more exposure. She began attending training sessions herself, sitting in the back, listening without interrupting. Leadership looked different now. Less polished, more accountable. Margaret Lewis watched the coverage taper off, as coverage always did. She clipped one article and placed it in a folder labeled Important. She showed it to her grandchildren one afternoon, not as history, but as instruction. Richard Coleman volunteered with a local advocacy group, quietly. No speeches, just presence. He learned that responsibility did not end with awareness. It began there. Thomas Reed took on a new assignment, helping design documentation protocols that assumed transparency instead of fearing it. He smiled more often now, not from comfort, but from alignment. Charles returned to his work, though the work had changed. He declined partnerships that resisted reform. He prioritized those who understood that dignity was not a marketing term. It was infrastructure. Months later, he boarded another flight. Different airline, same seat designation. No hesitation, no glances. Just service rendered without assumption. He noted it without satisfaction. This was how it should have always been. As the aircraft leveled off, he looked around the cabin. People reading, sleeping, talking softly, ordinary moments made possible by invisible decisions. Change rarely announced itself with fanfare. More often, it showed up as absence. The absence of fear, the absence of scrutiny, the absence of having to prove you belonged where you already were. The story did not end with applause. It continued in policies rewritten, habits challenged, voices taken seriously before escalation. If this story mattered to you, if you believe dignity should never require explanation, take a moment to like and subscribe, and share your thoughts by commenting 3 simple words. Dignity over assumptions.